The Four Seasons Beverly Hills glittered that night like a jewel polished too many times, its chandeliers spilling golden light over white linen tables, polished cutlery, and crystal glasses that reflected the shimmer of wealth and ambition. Every guest in the banquet hall had been handpicked. Senators, investors, journalists, CEOs, all gathered for one reason: to witness the possible birth of a $200 million alliance between Carter Drake, the slick young founder of Drake Nova Technologies, and Elliot Stone, the legendary investor whose nickname, the Silent Storm, came not from words but from the sheer gravity of his presence. Carter, only 38 but already intoxicated with his own success, carried himself with the kind of confidence that walks into a room expecting applause. He wore a tailored navy suit that clung to his lean frame and shined like it belonged under magazine lights, his cufflinks glinting every time he adjusted his sleeves, as if reminding the world of his meticulous taste. Across the table sat Elliot, 72, quiet, silver-haired, eyes like steel behind the calm, a man who had built empires by saying less than anyone else. Tonight, Elliot hadn't come for a show of numbers. He'd come to watch Carter reveal himself, because money is only safe in hands that understand people. And there, weaving carefully between the tables, stood Naomi Bennett, 26, holding her tray with steady grace, the picture of professionalism in a black and white uniform that made her nearly invisible to the power brokers around her. She was not invisible to Carter, though, not when a slip of her hand tipped a Bordeaux glass and sent crimson liquid trailing down the sleeve of his immaculate suit. For one heartbeat, the hall froze. Forks hovered. The jazz band stalled between notes. Heads turned. And then came the words that shattered everything. Carter didn't lower his voice, didn't soften the blow. He sneered, "Don't touch me, you stupid girl." The insult cracked across the air like a whip, carrying with it not just disdain but a darkness that exposed what he thought of anyone not wearing his kind of suit, not sitting at his kind of table. Naomi's hands trembled for a second, but then she steadied them with the kind of quiet strength only years of storms can teach. She blotted the spill, apologized with calm dignity, and stepped back without lowering her head. Her silence was not weakness. It was defiance wrapped in grace, a refusal to crumble in front of the very man who believed his wealth gave him the right to belittle. The room shifted uncomfortably. Phones tilted subtly, recording, because in this age no cruelty goes unseen for long. Elliot Stone did not speak, but he set his fork down slowly, his gaze resting on Naomi as if weighing not the deal before him, but the man across from him. Carter adjusted his cufflinks again, muttering about people knowing their place as if that could sew the fabric of the evening back together, but no thread could stitch what had already torn. Naomi continued her work, pouring water, picking up a child's fallen crayon, smiling softly at a guest who tried to mask her discomfort, and in those simple acts she held the room in a balance Carter could not reclaim. He leaned in to Elliot, rattling off numbers about ROI, expansion, synergy, but his words floated hollow, disconnected, because the deal was no longer about money. It was about values, and values had just been put to the test. Then, in a move that pushed the night beyond recovery, Carter's hand snapped out and clamped around Naomi's wrist as she passed, not crushing, not bruising, but firm enough to brand the gesture with arrogance. His voice, low but sharp, cut across the small space between them. "When men are talking, you stand still." The hush that followed was deafening. Naomi's eyes met his, steady, unbroken, her voice flat and calm as she pulled her wrist free. "Yes, sir. I understand." She walked on, pouring water for the next guest without a stutter in her step, the picture of composure, yet the truth was laid bare. Elliot lifted his head then, his quiet voice carrying more weight than Carter's. "Booming arrogance ever could. It's time." The words weren't aimed at Carter. They were for his aide, who slipped discreetly out of the room, phone in hand. The investors present exchanged glances, some already typing quiet messages beneath the tablecloths. The tide had shifted. What Carter had built in 15 years of deals, branding and arrogance had just begun to unravel in a single evening, because in that hall, among the glitter and jazz, dignity had taken the stage, and the world was already watching. Naomi Bennett's journey to that glittering hall did not begin with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors, but with a cramped apartment that smelled faintly of rain-soaked laundry and stale bread. The kind of place where survival was measured not in dollars but in determination. She had been 7 when the world split beneath her feet. When her father disappeared into the fog of broken promises and her mother, too tired from holding everything together alone, slipped quietly away, leaving Naomi and her younger brother, Eli, standing in a social worker's office with plastic bags for suitcases and fear written on their small faces. Naomi's earliest memories were not of dolls or birthday cakes, but of shielding her brother from shouting voices and carrying his small body up flights of stairs when his legs failed him because of the cerebral palsy that bound him to therapy schedules and hospital visits. She learned early that strength was not loud. It was the ability to hold your brother's hand steady when the doctor gave news you barely understood, to swallow hunger so he could eat the last sandwich, to trade laughter for night shifts so he wouldn't see her cry. It was in those fragile years that Elliot Stone entered their lives, not with fanfare but with the quiet steadiness of a man who believed in second chances, a man whose wife had longed to fill their home with children, but lost that chance to the cruelty of illness. Elliot had seen Naomi standing fiercely in front of Eli in a courtroom lobby, refusing to be separated from him even when officials warned her it would be easier that way. And something in her unflinching eyes stirred the part of him that knew resilience when he saw it. He adopted both of them, not to save them but to stand beside them, and though Naomi never changed her last name, she carried the name Bennett with a pride that came not from ease, but from endurance. In high school, she had been a star on the track, her legs cutting the wind, her coaches whispering about scholarships, but when Eli's therapy bills piled higher than trophies, she boxed her running shoes away and replaced them with aprons and time cards, stitching double shifts together like a patchwork quilt of survival. Elliot had offered her a place within Stone Holdings, a safe desk and a salary that could have lifted much of the weight. But Naomi refused. She wanted to know how power truly behaved when it thought no one important was watching. She tied aprons around her waist and carried trays into rooms where billionaires laughed too loudly, where politicians whispered in shadows, where men like Carter Drake believed waitstaff were furniture with hands. For Naomi, invisibility was not humiliation. It was armor, a way to study the raw truth of people stripped of their public masks. Each spilled drink, each impatient snap of fingers, each absent-minded thank you became part of her unspoken education, teaching her that the most dangerous currency in the world was not money, but the belief that money excused cruelty. By the time she stood in that Beverly Hills banquet hall, she carried not just a tray but years of scars polished into composure, years of storms weathered until she could walk into any room and not bow, not break. Elliot, sitting across from Carter, knew every detail of her journey, though Naomi never asked for his protection. He had watched her insist on climbing from the basement instead of taking an elevator he could have built for her. He admired her for it, respected her for it, and tonight, as Carter's words and actions burned through the air like acid, Elliot knew this was no accident of spilled wine. It was the very test Naomi had been preparing for. Carter thought he was humiliating a waitress, but what he had done was reveal himself before the one man in the room whose approval he desperately needed, and before the daughter of that man, whose silent endurance held more power in that moment than Carter's billions could buy. Naomi, moving gracefully from guest to guest as if nothing had shattered, was not just serving water. She was teaching the entire room a lesson about dignity, a lesson recorded not only by hidden cameras but by the conscience of everyone present. And Elliot, who had built empires by choosing where to place his faith, leaned back in his chair and thought of something his late wife once told him. Character is not what you show when you're winning. It's what you reveal when you think no one is watching. Carter Drake had revealed his. Naomi Bennett had revealed hers. And Elliot Stone, silent storm of Wall Street, knew in that instant which of the two would determine the future of the deal. The banquet hall, once a theater of polite laughter and clinking glasses, had shifted into something else entirely, a stage where the tension hummed beneath every note of the jazz band that struggled to recover its rhythm, where forks were lowered, gently as though each movement risked shattering the fragile silence that Carter Drake had torn open with his careless cruelty. Naomi's composure, the calm dignity with which she continued her work, poured water, returned a child's fallen crayon, and smiled at the older guests with a quiet kindness that never cracked, became the true melody of the night, though Carter remained too self-assured to hear it. He leaned in across the table, brushing at the red stain on his sleeve as though a dry cleaner could erase not just the wine, but the insult that had already soaked through the fabric of his reputation, and he rattled off his numbers. Distribution, synergies, double ROI in 18 months, integration timelines. But those words floated now like balloons cut loose, drifting uselessly because the room was no longer anchored to money. It was tethered to morality. Investors exchanged quick, subtle glances across the tablecloths, whispers slipped from one ear to another, and phones were pulled discreetly from suit pockets, not for distractions, but for recording, for messaging, for confirming whether what they had just witnessed was already spreading outside the walls of the Four Seasons. And it was. In corners of the room, screens glowed with breaking notifications. Incident at Beverly Hills banquet. Drake Nova CEO sparks outrage. A financial journalist who had been seated 2 tables away, camera tilted carefully beneath his napkin, sent out a message to his editor. "I have video. Do we push?" And the reply came almost instantly. "Send. Publish hot. Medium priority. But move now." Across the table, Elliot Stone sat in perfect stillness, his fingers folded lightly over his utensils, his eyes locked not on Carter but on Naomi, as if she were the only person who mattered in that vast golden hall, as though the truth of a $200 million decision rested in the way she moved with grace under insult rather than in the way Carter's spreadsheets sparkled with projections. Elliot's aide, who had slipped out earlier at the quiet command, returned through the side door, leaning briefly down to murmur in his ear, and with one slow nod, Elliot confirmed the silent signal that no one else yet fully understood. Meanwhile, Carter, sensing the weight of the silence but misinterpreting it as awe or hesitation, doubled down. His voice a confident hum rehearsed from boardrooms where no one dared contradict him. "Winners," he declared, gesturing slightly with his wine glass as though toasting himself. "Don't get distracted. They keep focus. They control the room." A few nervous nods came from his team at the far end of the table, executives, too afraid to contradict the man signing their paychecks, but the investors, senators, and guests who mattered most exchanged no nods, only silence. The kind of silence that condemns without raising its voice. Naomi, still invisible by her own design yet luminous in that moment, moved around the table with poise, her every step a reminder that real control is not grasped with force, but held through composure. Carter's jaw tightened as he noticed the order in which she served, the elders first, then assistants, then investors, and only lastly him, as though she were following a code he could not break, and the fact that he came last burned in his pride like a hidden wound. He muttered under his breath, sharp enough for her to hear, "Still learning your place, I see." Words meant to cut, but instead they hung in the air like smoke no one could ignore. Naomi gave no reaction, did not flinch, did not falter. She simply continued with her task, her silence more powerful than a retort, because in that silence every guest heard what he had just confessed about himself. At a back table, a senator leaned closer to his advisor, whispering about systemic risk, about culture, about how investors don't just buy products, they buy the man behind them. And in that whisper, the $200 million deal already began to crumble like sand slipping through fingers. Carter still spoke of numbers, his tone smooth and rehearsed, but Elliot Stone had not heard a single figure since Carter's hand had closed around Naomi's wrist, because Elliot was no longer measuring profits, he was measuring character. And in that measure, Carter had already failed. Phones buzzed more insistently now, newsrooms drafting headlines, publicists preparing statements, tweets half-written and waiting for confirmation before detonating across the digital world. The banquet hall, though gilded and serene, was no longer private. It had become a glass box under a floodlight, and everyone inside could feel the burn of the gaze outside. Yet Naomi, who had spent her life navigating storms far worse than this, never faltered. She did not argue, did not protest. She simply carried herself with the dignity of someone who knew that storms expose truth, and truth once seen cannot be unseen. Elliot watched her with quiet pride, his late wife's words echoing in his mind. And he knew now that the storm had passed judgment. The deal was no longer in Carter's hands. It never had been. It belonged now to the dignity of a young woman, who had been underestimated, dismissed, and insulted, and to the silent storm of Elliot Stone, who had built his empire not on arrogance, but on recognizing the value of character when it stood, unbent, in the face of contempt. The hum of whispered conversations, the faint buzz of phones, and the uneasy shifting of chairs all stilled the moment Elliot Stone rose from his seat, his movements unhurried, his expression calm but carrying the weight of a gavel. He did not clear his throat or tap a glass for attention. The room simply surrendered to silence, as though some ancient instinct understood that when the silent storm stood, words would follow that no one could afford to miss. Carter, mistaking the hush as a signal of his own dominance, leaned back with a self-satisfied smirk, ready to reclaim the stage he thought had only briefly slipped from his control. But the room was no longer his. It belonged to Elliot, and to the quiet grace of Naomi Bennett, who stood a few steps away, still holding her tray with a dignity that no insult could stain. Elliot's gaze swept the hall before settling on her, his voice soft but resonant, carrying to every corner of the glittering banquet chamber. "Before we continue this discussion of numbers," he said, "there is someone I want you all to meet properly." Heads turned, breaths caught, the weight of the moment pressing down as Naomi slowly stepped forward, not summoned like a servant, but invited like an equal. She removed her apron and laid the tray down on a side table, straightened her shoulders, and walked with a calmness that magnified the sound of her footsteps against marble floors. She stopped at Elliot's side, not behind him, her presence immediately altering the geometry of the evening. No longer background, but center. Elliot placed a steady hand on her shoulder and spoke again, his voice carrying the clarity of truth. "This is Naomi Bennett. She is my daughter." A ripple of shock moved through the hall like a current. Phones dipped lower, cameras tilted higher, gasps pressed against held breaths. Naomi's face did not change. She had lived through storms far greater than gasps. But Carter's expression cracked, his rigid smile faltering, eyes widening in disbelief, as though the rug had been yanked from beneath his polished shoes. Elliot's words rolled forward, measured and undeniable. "I adopted Naomi when she was 7. She kept her name, Bennett, because it is her story, and I respect her story. She has chosen to work here, not because she needs the money, but because she wanted to see how power behaves when it believes no one important is watching. Tonight, she received her answer." He did not raise his voice, did not accuse, did not need to. He simply held up a mirror, and Carter's reflection shone darkly in it for all to see. Carter stumbled over words, scrambling to rebuild the image that had collapsed in seconds. "This has been misunderstood. She spilled wine on my suit." I reacted, perhaps too sharply, but it wasn't. His excuses faltered under Elliot's steady interruption, his voice like stone cutting through glass. "You said what you believed. You did what you thought you had the right to do. That is enough. When character is tested in public, consequences arrive in public." The silence that followed was heavier than any speech could have been. And then, one by one, chairs began to scrape back across the polished floor as investors, senators, and business partners rose from their seats, not with fanfare, not with words, but with the quiet power of walking away. Each step was a verdict. Each turned back was a sentence. Carter looked around wildly, his smirk gone, replaced with the panic of a man realizing the tide had already washed him out to sea. Elliot remained standing tall, Naomi beside him, the embodiment of grace and truth that had outshone arrogance and contempt. The deal, the $200 million Carter had believed was his triumph, evaporated in the space of a heartbeat, not because of financials, but because dignity had taken its rightful place at the head of the table, and the world had seen it. By the next morning, the Four Seasons banquet was no longer a private memory of hushed whispers and tense stares. It had become the epicenter of a storm that no amount of PR spin or money could contain. The video clips, grainy yet damning, spread like wildfire across every corner of the digital world. Carter Drake's sneer frozen in mid-sentence, his hand gripping Naomi's wrist, his words laced with arrogance, juxtaposed with Naomi's calm silence, her quiet dignity, and finally the towering figure of Elliot Stone introducing her to the world as his daughter. Headlines blazed across news feeds and financial tickers alike. Investor Elliot Stone cancels $200 million deal over CEO's public insult. Some outlets ran it under banners of business ethics, others under breaking culture shifts. But all agreed on one truth, that money had bent, but dignity had not. Carter's PR team scrambled desperately, issuing statements about misunderstandings, about stress, about regrettable phrasing, yet the world had already judged, and in the court of public opinion, no apology drafted by lawyers could erase the clarity of a video where contempt dripped so easily from his lips. Stock in Drake Nova plummeted by noon, wiping away millions more than the original deal had promised, while investors quietly withdrew not just their money but their trust, whispering that culture eats strategy for breakfast and arrogance is the greatest liability. Carter's board convened emergency meetings behind closed doors, but leaks emerged anyway, directors furious, clients pulling out, lawsuits whispered in the wings. And while Carter's empire crumbled, Naomi returned to her work with the same steady composure she had carried the night before, tying her apron as though nothing had changed, because for her, dignity was not performance, but a constant, a thread woven through her being. Yet she could not remain invisible any longer, for reporters lined the sidewalks, guests from the banquet spoke to journalists about the way she carried herself, and strangers across the globe flooded comment sections with words of admiration. The waitress who held her dignity became not just a headline but a symbol, proof that strength does not always roar. It often endures silently until the world is forced to notice. Elliot Stone, true to his nature, did not give interviews or speeches. His only public statement was simple. We invest not just in profits but in people. Our trust belongs where dignity lives. Those few words were enough to send ripples across industries where leaders whispered about ethics, where employees quietly shared the clip, with hope that their own dignity might one day outweigh their boss's contempt. And Naomi, though thrust into a spotlight she had never sought, carried herself no differently than before. She rose each morning to make sure Eli got to his therapy sessions. She folded her running shoes neatly back into the closet with a promise of someday, and she poured coffee for guests with the same measured grace. But something had changed nonetheless. People saw her now, not as invisible staff, not as background noise to wealth, but as a reminder that character is the true currency. In the weeks that followed, job offers arrived, scholarships reopened, foundations asked her to speak, yet Naomi measured them not by money but by meaning, choosing carefully where her voice could echo with purpose. Carter Drake, stripped of his deal, his image, and soon his title as board pressures mounted, became a cautionary tale retold in business schools and boardrooms alike. Not about market failures or financial miscalculations, but about the simple truth that arrogance blinds, and when arrogance collides with dignity, dignity endures. The banquet hall that night had held $200 million in potential profit, but what it revealed was priceless. That the measure of a person is not in the wealth they wield, but in the respect they show, and that sometimes the most powerful storm is not the one that shouts, but the one that stands in silence until the world itself must listen. And so Naomi Bennett, the young woman who chose invisibility as armor, walked into history not as a waitress humiliated, but as a daughter honored, a sister steadfast, and above all as a woman whose dignity reminded the world that true power is never bought, it is revealed.